Welcome back to episode 29 of Titans Up. Today, we have Dr. Alexander Pfeiffer, the founder and CEO of Terralytic, a firm that helps suppliers to reduce carbon emissions across their value chain. And what we are going to be talking about today will be decarbonization, supply chains, geopolitics, and some other very exciting topics that connect with that. Dr. Alexander, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Most definitely. I enjoyed our initial conversation where we talked about the deeper dynamics of how these things function. We're definitely going to tap your expertise on that. But you were formerly a partner at McKinsey. You did that for many years. And now you're living in Curaçao, which is just north of Venezuela. Is that right?
That's correct. And weirdly enough, I can still say I live in the Netherlands, but it is Curaçao geographically currently, yes.
And what brought you there of all places?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I get this often when I talk to lots of different people, right? As I'm originally from Germany, I've been living in the Netherlands for the past many years. My wife is Dutch. My kids are being raised trilingual, so German, Dutch, English. And when I left McKinsey a few years ago, and started Terralytic, I quickly realized that with my co-founder being in Austin in Texas, most of my team being in the US, time zones was a big issue. So my wife decided to connect the useful with the pleasant and look for ways to work remotely. We were both already working mostly remotely. So we're looking for ways to bridge the time zone a bit, while at the same time my kids could still go to a Dutch-speaking school and daycare. And Curaçao is a former Dutch colony, so you have Dutch as one of the official languages here. There's a huge Dutch community on this island. But conveniently, it's also only an hour away from New York, time zone-wise. In summer, even the same time zone, 2 hours away from Austin, Texas. And I have a lot of overlap in all directions. Europe, it's 5 hours away. Most of the US time zones, only a few hours. Direct travel connections in both directions. And it's Dutch-speaking. And here we are 2 years later. It works well so far. But I'm also planning to move back to the Netherlands to be closer to family again later this year.
Got it.
Yeah, I should probably not hide the fact that this is also a very nice area to live in. Within the week, it doesn't really change much. You're in an office, air condition running, and you're working. But on the weekends, you get to do very nice things. Going to the beach, going scuba diving, which is something I really like doing, kite surfing, and things that you typically don't get to do when you're living in the Netherlands.
I bring that up because when we're talking about nature, the environment, sustainability, decarbonization, that kind of environment is the thing we want to protect. So talk a little bit about your time at McKinsey and some of the things you learned there and how it informed what you're doing today with Terralytic and your outlook on decarbonization and why it is so important.
Yeah, lots of good questions. I'll see that I can answer them all. I actually joined McKinsey back in 2011, already with a clear objective to work on sustainability topics. I'd learned that McKinsey had what they called back then the Sustainability and Resource Productivity Practice, SRP, which was their first sustainability practice. I joined McKinsey. What I did not foresee was that it was a very competitive market, interestingly enough. So within McKinsey, there were many people that wanted to work on these projects. And with my business school background, I was not necessarily the profile that was chosen. They chose water engineers, energy engineers, etc., for those projects. So I had a hard time breaking in. There were not many projects to go around back in the days. So I decided, I did some work on the energy transition, especially in Germany, where I'm from and where I started my career, worked for solar cells, etc. But I quickly realized I did not have the background nor the knowledge to be really helpful and useful. So in 2013, I should say, I left McKinsey for a while and I pursued my PhD in Oxford on a topic that's called stranded assets, which is basically the question what happens to all the polluting infrastructure when we stop emitting, to all those coal plants, gas plants, pipelines, etc. Someone invested, someone owns it. So what happens if we stop using it? So that was my PhD topic. I stayed for 3.5 years. I graduated in 2018 and then returned to McKinsey. And then really the remainder of my time there, another 5 years, I worked exclusively on energy transition and sustainability topics. And that's also what ultimately brought me to create Terralytic.
And what were some of the insights that led to that? Was there a specific moment where you realized in that area where you want to drive value and drive change, that Terralytic was the right solution? And what was that moment?
Yeah, very much. Consulting has an important role to play. And beyond McKinsey, many other consulting companies that all specialize in certain areas and mostly do good work. I think what I realized was that the sheer scale and timing of that challenge is something that consulting can accompany. Give you an example. Most of the companies out there, if they have net zero targets, those targets are somewhere in the late 2030s, 2040s, or even 2050. So they will, over the next decades, have to work on this. And it's no small feat. They have tens of thousands of suppliers, many own facilities, and there's emissions or point sources of emissions just everywhere. If you want to transition all of this from where it is today to a clean and low or net zero emissions state, that is a lot of work and it takes a long time. Most of the consulting companies are not set up to accompany this. They can help you strategize, perhaps set up the program, define what the target organizational structure looks like, but they cannot go with you for the coming 10 years. You wouldn't want that because they're not cheap. So this is all to say that my now co-founder, who was back then my colleague, Will Glazner, and I both realized that software had an important role to play there, because software is meant to accompany a company and tech enable the work that the own employees and the organization is doing over a long time. So we firmly believe there was a software play and software had an important role to play. And that's why we first tried to actually implement this within McKinsey and really try to push hard for some sort of software business model. But McKinsey, for understandable reasons, decided that their main priority is being a consulting company. And therefore, we decided to part ways in a friendly way back in 2022. And we then went on to create Terralytic.
And what about what you do? What does Terralytic really do for these suppliers to help them transition and to achieve those targets?
Yeah, I was waiting for that question, of course. We are a surprisingly specialized company. So we're not looking at all scopes, really. For those of you who are familiar with the carbon emissions lingo, there's different scopes of emissions. Scope 1, the emissions that you cause yourself by burning fossil fuels. Scope 2, the emissions that you procure by electricity. So when you procure electricity, that's your scope 2. And then there's scope 3 up and downstream, which is all the rest. All the firm cars that you drive and own, the employee commuting, the purchased goods and services, and so on. We focus very much on this, the purchased goods and services. So when our customers, usually large manufacturing companies, they buy large quantities of materials, different metals like steel and aluminum, different plastics, electronics, glass, rubber, cement, these kind of things, and they produce physical goods out of that. We help them understand where and how emissions happen in their value chain with their suppliers. We help them track that and really get to the bottom of it. What are the drivers of that? Is it the generation of heat? Is it in turn the electricity consumption of your suppliers? Is it perhaps process emissions? And we then help them identify interventions that they can discuss and implement with their suppliers to reduce those emissions. That's really the very specialized thing we do. We don't really care, in quotation marks, about the emissions that our customers cause themselves by burning fossil fuels in their own facilities. There's many other providers that do a very good job in this, but we really care about helping them understand where in the portfolio of my tens of thousands of suppliers does it make sense to start first? Because where are the biggest drivers of emissions and where can I have a positive impact today?
And that's on the supplier level scale. What about the game theory or really the geopolitical scale and really, let's say, the ultimate change? Because your goal is to remove 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions from supply chains. So how do we get there?
Yeah. So supply chains are surprisingly deep and wide. For many companies, their supply chain emissions make up the by far biggest part of their footprint. It sounds counterintuitively because when we think of large manufacturers, we naturally think of smoking, chimneys, and whatnot. That is not the case anymore. Most manufacturers themselves, they just use a bit of electricity. Perhaps they have some natural gas at facilities to work on metals, etc. And then, of course, they have business travel, etc. Now, depending on what you produce, you might have some downstream, which means your product in its use phase emits as well. Think of an automobile that emits a lot of CO2 when you drive around and burn fossil fuels, right? But for many companies, upstream, meaning the materials they buy and the components, etc., that's where by far most of their emissions are. To give you a bit of a number, right? I think on average, it's anywhere between 70 to 90% for most companies. Some of our customers, 95% or more of their emissions, of everything that they are responsible for, is in their supply chain. Now, if I take that and I translate that, it means like if we just work with a couple of large manufacturers, think of large automotive companies, large industrial goods manufacturers, perhaps aviation, if we help just a few of those really clean up their value chain, work with all those steel manufacturers, aluminum smelters, etc., plastic producers, that can have an incredible impact, right? And we're talking megatons, which means millions of tons of CO2 in the supply chain of a single company. Now, if you translate that, then we just need to work with 100 companies and we already have our billion. Companies have a huge impact, especially if they are large buyers of materials. They set demand signals. If they set the signal, perhaps in a conglomerate with others, and they said, this auto OEM, automobile producer X, together with a couple more, we all want green steel and we all want green aluminum. If they credibly transport that signal into the market, they set an incentive for the suppliers of that to invest in a smelter with renewable electricity or an inert anode, which is a technology to reduce emissions in aluminum. So you have a huge impact and you have the opportunity to create a lot as those big companies, and we want to help them.
And we're talking about the numbers behind everything and, how these big companies can make a big difference just by shifting what their demand is. One of the other numbers that comes up and really is probably the main barrier or force behind true transformational change occurring is really just the numbers and the finance behind it. So if we look at when China, coal is very cheap, they're burning tons of coal. You look at the Paris Accord that the United States pulled out of due to deeming that it was unfair against United States companies, it really comes down to the dollars. So where is that financial element at today in terms of 2025? And how do you see that shifting? Are there specific things that these companies can do? You mentioned shifting what they have demand for, but these companies or innovators in the space that could accelerate these things that you might have some insight for.
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think just pick one out. Where is it today? It's changing. So we are in some times of great uncertainty, I would say. And that's not only driven by the US pulling out of the Paris Accord, right? You also see Europe, which I think in just 11 days from now is going to announce what they call an omnibus regulation, which is meant to combine and simplify a lot of climate regulation. And everyone is curiously waiting what it will include and how this will change things. And what I will say is, first of all, decarbonizing is still not cheap, period. And anyone who says something else, I believe, hasn't understood it or is to a certain extent naive. If you look at the marginal abatement cost curves, and for those of you who are not familiar, that's an analysis which decarbonization initiatives are saving you money, which are cost neutral, which ones are costly. You'll see an overwhelming part of those initiatives is still costing money. So changing from the way we do things today to reducing emissions is going to cost money in many cases. Now, this is going to change. Technologies have become cheaper over time, and the more we use them, the cheaper they become. And second, there is already today lots of things we can do to actually reduce emissions and cost. To give you a couple of examples, there are certain things in the design of the products we can do that will reduce the materials that are used and that will reduce cost and emissions. There are certain things around energy efficiency that will immediately reduce cost. It typically takes an investment, but that is paid back very quickly. So there are many things today that you can do and that reduce emissions and cost. And those are typically the things that we recommend to do first. Then there's a long part of things that come at cost neutral. So it doesn't cost you much, or maybe it saves a little bit. And then there's those things that are most expensive. Very few companies today are willing to do things that will cost them money. So we typically recommend to do the things that save you money. That's just good business. And if you want to have a positive impact, then you should also do those things that will not cost or save you money, but that will save carbon. Now, for the future, in order to do these things that are actually expensive to do, you need a business case for that. That means you have to find those pockets where you do those things, and then you are able to sell that product that you produce at a green premium. I've seen this working in my time at McKinsey, companies that, carve out a product line or certain facility, and they reduce the emissions. They do this in a way that is auditable, so they can prove it, and then they sell it at a green premium. But those pockets are small today. So over time, if you really want to have an impact, you have to identify those initiatives that you can do. Then you have to identify those initiatives that will actually help you get a price premium or go into certain new markets. And only that will work. Very few companies will invest tons of money for things that they don't see a business case on. That's just what businesses do. There are, of course, some that do it, and kudos to those, but that's very rare.
What are some of the misconceptions that some of these companies may have, the biggest contributors to emissions, that you might guide them through and help them realize that aren't actually true?
I would say the biggest misconception is that reducing your emissions is extremely expensive. Now, what I just said is it's going to cost money, right? But it costs less money in some cases than you would think. And also here, I want to give you an example, a very concrete example. We did an analysis on an electric truck. It was a large truck manufacturer that we've did some work with. We looked at one of the models that they want to launch in the future. It is a battery electric truck. And the challenge here was to identify all the initiatives would have to be taken to reduce the emissions to near or net zero. So we built that roadmap for them. And we also looked into what would that cost. And it turns out the sort of net extra cost per truck was about €1,000. €1,000 on an entire truck, right? Production costs of that truck are what, maybe 20, 25,000, depending on the truck, and what happens to the battery, of course. But it was not this sort of 50% extra that many expect. It was just a couple of percent extra. And we did this analysis for other products as well. And it turns out many of those products can be decarbonized with an extra cost of anywhere between 3 and 10%. Identifying that and identifying those products makes it much more likely, much more possible to then go out and find a business case. Again, not everyone will be willing or able to pay $1,000 extra for a truck. There's enough logistics companies or other big fleet operators that operate with very low margins, but there will be some that are willing to do that. So you can identify those business cases and it can have a big impact.
It could be a deeper misconception within that, or just another way to say it would be that you need to, if you look at it on the lines of a spectrum, it's this complete purist, you need to be zero emission right away kind of mind. Let's take the smart decisions that we can along the way. Let's find out what these efficiencies are. Let's find out how we can improve the emission levels that we're currently at in a way that's economically feasible and also can inspire demand and really resonate with the pockets of consumers who want to buy these types of products.
Percent. And if you think about it, it's crazy what sometimes the conversation in the room is. Like there's people talking about how do we reduce cement emissions? And don't get me wrong, that is an important question. But there's so many things that we can do in the meantime. Cement is very hard to decarbonize, and so are other things, right? Aviation, maritime. Yes, there's e-fuels and hydrogen and whatnot. And we need to talk about these things as well. But in the meantime, our emissions are still growing year on year. That idea that we're now talking and debating about how do we get those last 5 to 10% out of the system, that is just crazy to me. And I keep telling this to all my customers and clients as well. I say, like, don't worry so much about you get from 10% of your emissions to 0%. Maybe you start with the easier 20% and then the somewhat harder middle 30%. And then maybe in the end, you worry about the very hard 50%. I think we just need to get going. That's really my main philosophy. Don't worry about the challenges that will happen in 10 years. Worry about those that are very near term and what you can do now. That's, I guess, probably one of my main mind-blowing misconceptions I sometimes see when people talk about these really hard to decarbonize things. I'm like, guys, that's really not what should worry you right now.
And also understanding that with CO2 emissions and carbon levels in particular, it's an exponential curve, not a linear curve. So if you're making a 5% change, well, over time, that actually would be compounding on itself to be much more significant in the greater scale of things.
Yeah, that's also very true. Plus, technological progress is quite quick. It's some of you who will be in that field, they might have seen these famous warm charts of the IEA that sort of show every year what the IEA has forecasted in terms of solar uptake. And then they show the forecast of the next year and the next year, and then what the actual line was. And everyone is just underestimating and underappreciating how quickly technological progress and scale up can be. So yeah, I'm very much with you. If we get started today and we just move on an exponential scale, within 10 years, we can have an incredible impact.
Hmm. And one of the things that you've heard, likely, we talked about a little bit of this, but this is slightly newer in just terms of the news cycles and whatnot. This is the view of, let's say, Trump and Musk, the ineffectiveness of wind. What are your thoughts on that? Would you say that wind is something that we should be doing, or are there different approaches that we should be taking that are going to be more effective? And I guess the greater question in this is, we talked a little bit about the purist mindset that some people believe that it should be zero. And those kind of people that say Tesla is not really that great because to make their tires cost so much in emissions. And so they're not really that clean and green. But of course, we want to be making step-by-step progress. And the other mindset that's similar to the mindset is that it's only going to be massive technological innovation that's going to change it, not some of these incremental improvements that we can make in the supply chains. What's your take on wind, and also the appropriate balance between the dependence on large scale technological innovations versus the right steps taken across a large swath of companies that are within this cycle of emitting and wanting to reduce their supply chain emissions?
Yeah, it's funny. So going back to the Tesla thing, right? At the moment, many people seem to say and think Tesla's not great, but for all the wrong reasons. I guess if you want to pick out one thing in a Tesla that's not great, it's probably the battery, right? It's a very emissive thing. I want to elevate this a bit to electric vehicles in general. There's this common criticism that, like, oh, but look, the electric vehicle contains a large lithium-ion battery that is very polluting in its production, and therefore it's not a good thing to do for the environment. And then depending on how you run this analysis and in what type of power grid and what type of assumptions, you can actually calculate it in a way that the life cycle emissions of driving a Tesla or any other electric vehicle are worse than just driving an efficient internal combustion engine. Now, what I will say is that most of those calculations that I have seen either emit certain things on the fossil fuel side, for example, the emissions that come from the extraction and the processing of fossil fuels and the transport, or they assume that electric vehicle in a very dirty grid that's also not gonna change over the next 10 years. So it's very assumption driven. What I will say is an electric vehicle is our best shot of actually getting transport emissions really down. You can make an internal combustion engine as efficient as you want. It will always emit. We can talk about biofuels or e-fuels, which, by the way, are very expensive still, and biofuels have their own challenges. An electric vehicle is our best shot of reducing transport emissions, which is one of the biggest emitting sectors in the world, to reduce that significantly. So I'm a huge fan of electric vehicles. I used to drive one, now on Curaçao, not anymore because there's no infrastructure. But as soon as I'm going back to the Netherlands, I will drive one again, period. Now, the other things that you mentioned, I will mention that I'm not an expert on renewables anymore. I used to work in that, but I haven't in a few years. And that makes me basically pretty useless. If you're not really following that, your knowledge is outdated quickly. What I will say on the general question is, you asked, should we do wind? My answer is yes. The question is to what extent and what else should we be doing? And I think there's no one silver bullet for solving climate change. There just is not. There's not this one technology that you can do and that will solve everything. Hydrogen fans have tried to tell us that story for a long time, and I think those dreams are at the moment exploding and the bubble is a bit popping. So my guess is we should be doing a lot of different things, of which onshore and offshore wind is one. Probably nuclear is another thing, right? I'm not a big fan of nuclear, but I think it is part of a portfolio of things that we should pursue to get to a solution for that. It might even include doing some more gas, natural gas power generation, which might play a role in the near term. Should we do wind? Yes, we should do wind on and offshore. We should continue to invest. Should we do nuclear? Probably we should continue to invest some in there to have it as an optionality and to solve certain pockets of challenge, right? Should we do electric vehicles? Yes, we should. So the beauty about this is that there's many different technologies that can help, and we should not claim that we know which single one will help. So we should invest in a lot of different things. Going back to Trump, wind is inefficient. I don't know that this is true. Wind prices have come down also significantly over the past. There have been projects that were actually in the money without large subsidies, right? So should we continue to do this? Of course we should.
Mm.
It's cheap energy, and it has the potential to be even cheaper, and it will help us in certain cases, and will have a contribution to a clean power grid. But should we therefore stop other things? No, we shouldn't.
So we talked about sensitive intervention points before, and maybe you've mentioned some of them there. But what are some of the things that are not sensitive intervention points before we get into those? And if you could also enlighten people on what those are, that would be excellent. And what is not a sensitive intervention point? What is not going to drive great change that we're doing today that might be in the common consumer mind that this is a good thing that really drives change, but in reality, it's not?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. So perhaps for the audience here, right? So sensitive intervention points are tipping points almost, where small nudges or small interventions can have an outsized impact because they shift a system from one state over the tipping point into another state, where it then self-enforces itself to go into that new state. So the idea is, if we just get the electric vehicles, and maybe that's also already my first example, right? But if you just get batteries cheap enough, so that then electric vehicles with its currently higher upfront cost are still cheaper over their lifetime, then everyone will drive electric vehicles and we have solved transport sector emissions. I'm simplifying here, but that is an example. So in theory, the only thing that's needed is perhaps some subsidies for a period of time, or some state guarantees for battery makers, whatever it is, right? That will help get this industry going. And then once those batteries are cheaper, then it goes by itself. I already gave you my first example. I think it's my best example, probably. So I almost said I gave it away so quickly. Yeah, but I think electric vehicles are a good example. The cost of batteries has come down significantly over the past couple of years. Again, quicker than many expected. And then that translates into cheaper electric vehicles. And together with a cheaper lifetime, because electricity in most regions is still cheaper than buying gasoline or diesel, that translates into you as a consumer will actually save money over the lifetime of your car by switching to an electric vehicle. That's great, right? And I think we should definitely push hard to get there quick, because then, okay, we have other challenges to solve, like how quickly can we scale this, but then at least the economic challenge is solved for now. Renewables is another situation. Many regions, electricity generated from solar and wind is actually cheaper than all other energy sources, and that includes natural gas, right? That is also great. It means that actually building out renewables in the electricity grid is an economically good business case. It's just a smart thing to do. It has nothing to do anymore with climate change. It's just a smart thing to do. There's a reason why Texas is one of the power grids with the biggest shares of renewables, and not only in the US, but like really worldwide. And when we think of Texas, we don't necessarily think of a sort of green vogue state, right? So I guess those are all good sensitive intervention points that I would continue to push. Thinking of producing green steel and aluminum, I think we're a bit further away mostly for green steel, and aluminum has its own challenges. But once we get there, this is great as well. Steel and aluminum cause a lot of emissions globally, but at the same time, they're the ingredients for many of the things that we do in every life. I'm looking at a MacBook right now, which is made mostly from aluminum, right? And I'm driving in a car which is made from steel. And many of the products we use are made from those ingredients. And getting to a situation where producing green aluminum and green steel is cheaper than the alternative would be a huge impact on the global emissions. To your second part of the questions, what are not sensitive interventions points? The obvious first, I think cold fusion is a dud, because I believe that this will happen. So I believe in the physics that eventually we will be able to build cold fusion generator that sustainably generate more energy and electricity than they use. But I think this is so far out that by the time that we have achieved this, and by the time this can scale to have a meaningful impact, we are long through our 1.5, 2, and probably 3-degree carbon budgets. So that's nothing I would focus on. I have my own issues with nuclear, because nuclear has not delivered the promised cost reductions. I think we should still put some investment in there just for the optionality, but I don't think that's something we should push hard. And then the most controversial one last, hydrogen. Hydrogen, I am not a big believer in hydrogen as a silver bullet for everything. I've looked into an old Shell scenario from, I believe, 2005 or 2006. And within this Shell scenario, Shell is very good in making scenarios, but Shell mentioned a hydrogen-powered electric bike. And they even had these little skits in there, like a little picture of a bike with a fuel cell on the bottom and a hydrogen tank in the back and an electric engine. And this is just from a perspective where we are today, it's just crazy. And I've seen hydrogen touted as the solution for almost everything. And I just simply don't see it happening because the infrastructure we would need to build, the advances we would have to make in producing hydrogen clean, because mind you, most of the hydrogen today is produced in a very dirty way by using natural gas and electricity and steam and basically cracking it into CO2 and hydrogen. So you actually produce CO2 with a side production of hydrogen. So very dirty. To get that to clean and to get that out in the world in tanks and pipelines, this challenge is so big that I just don't see it happening for every aspect of your life. So I don't believe in hydrogen as a sensible intervention point. And I know many people do. So I'm looking forward to seeing the comments on this and happy to engage in the conversation here.
And what about on the individual level, changes like diet changes, changing to different food sources from, let's say, plant-based, that is, from meat eating? How big of an impact does that really play? And Elon Musk is touted to say that the effect is incalculable in the sense of how minuscule it is, but we really do not hear that. And is he wrong? Because there's other people who are very smart that say we need to do it, and it's very important and effective at helping us to reach these budgets and targets.
Yeah, he's not wrong. No. And I certainly don't agree with Elon Musk on everything, especially not these days. I don't need to agree with him on everything, right? He probably doesn't know I exist, so that's fine. I guess to that particular question, I think it can have an impact. So I personally have chosen to reduce my meat intake. I have not switched to a fully plant-based diet. In fact, after this interview here ends, I will have a barbecue with friends that I invited over, and I will certainly eat some beef and some chicken. I have just reduced it. Equal parts. I feel sorry for the animals, how we treat them in our global sort of food value chain, right? And then equal parts environment. But yeah, the effect is minuscule. I've actually calculated it and it's on my LinkedIn, right? I posted about this. I had some effect, some impact of it, but compared to the production of 1 ton of steel, it's nothing, simply nothing. So in that aspect, he's right. And similar can be said about many other things. If there's one thing I could give as a message, and I don't want to be overly political, so I'm not going to mention any individual party, but I think with our choices, which politicians to vote for, or which parties to vote for, we have a much bigger impact than with anything we can do in our personal lifestyle. And I'll explain it. In order to get these, I don't believe that humans will stop eating meat in any foreseeable time scale, right? Many have just started increasing the share of meat in their diet, and they're not going to give up on this anymore. In Europe and the US, we just like our meat, right? And I don't think that everyone will, within the next 10 years, go to a fully plant-based diet. That's number one. And similar can be said for things like stop flying, right? Or stop using an air conditioner, or whatever it is. We just simply won't sacrifice comfort and consume to a certain extent. And everyone who sees this as the solution to climate change, again, going back to what I said earlier, is just naive, right? It's a nice idea, but it won't happen. So we need to make sure that those services and products are produced in a cleaner way, in a way that does not harm or destroy our environment. Now, to get there, we know what we need. We have the technologies in most cases, not for all sources of emissions, but for things like steel, aluminum, even meat to a certain extent, we have technologies that will reduce emissions. So now the question is just how do we get the technologies over these tipping points where they are cheap enough that they are seeing that scale up, and how can we support the scale up? And that is a role of a private sector together with politics, because the politics need to set the foreseeable framework for that. An example here is the CBAM in Europe, where politicians now say every imported emissions will have to be taxed, because our own industry cannot be at a disadvantage because we tell them to decarbonize. They have higher cost from that, and then everyone else is just flooding the European market with cheaper stuff because they can still emit. So politicians have to set a rule that this is not possible so that we can continue to decarbonize and not lose our economy about this. So that's the role of politicians. So going back to your original question, the biggest impact you can have is the vote that you cast, as long as you can cast that vote freely. And that's probably not the only thing that you should look at, but it should be one of the factors that you look at and then make your choice that takes that into account. And with that, you will have a much bigger impact than if you switch to plant-based only. That being said, doing small changes in your daily life can also have an impact because they set a demand signal. So if you consciously choose to go for, let's say, green electricity, choose a green electricity provider, or perhaps even things like buying sustainable aviation fuel when you fly, that sets a signal, right? Maybe you only reduce by 1 ton or 2 tons or whatever, which is compared to 40 billion tons really small. But you send a signal to those companies that the customer wants this and is willing to pay for it. And then I go back to what I said earlier. That's a business case. So then a company moves, right? So set demand signals and cast your vote wisely. Those are really important factors.
Have you ever seen the show Alone?
I know Home Alone, but I don't think I saw the show Alone. No.
So Alone is a survival series type show where they send people out in the wilderness. They send 10 people out or 12 people, and essentially they just have to forage and hunt and make their life off the land that they've been given. So they put people in these extreme circumstances. One of them that was just recently popular on Netflix and still currently is the one in Australia. Another one was in Saskatchewan in Canada. You realize, of course, very extreme circumstances, but the importance of meat, because these people, they can go and forage berries, they can go and forage these roots and tubers and little things that they can eat. But ultimately, if they're not eating meat, they will not win the show and they will degrade. Meat is somewhat embedded in our survival and our culture in the way that we like to just enjoy our lives. You mentioned the United States and Europe loving different types of meat, but definitely in Asia, the appetite for pork is not going anywhere. And so really, to go back to what we've talked about and connect some of the elements, it's shifting from a linear model to a systemic model where, over 1 billion people that are making a 5 to 10% difference in the way that they consume is not only going to make them healthier and have less load on, let's say, different areas of the healthcare system if they are genuinely healthier across a systemic level, but also just that, again, that comprehensive impact that can come into play over, again, the billions and billions of people. Just an interesting point to note. I was pretty obsessed about those shows over the last couple of weeks. I was sick. You mentioned you were sick as well. But meat is a very important part of our culture. And to summarize a lot of the things you're saying, there are more important places where we can focus, like in the supply chains and like with steel and aluminum and different materials. So let's just focus on steel, for example. And I also would like to highlight for people what you mentioned about the difference with now taxations as things are being imported, because there needs to be some force that these economies that are decarbonizing need to enact, or else the law of numbers of demand will win out, where people want to pay cheaper for equivalent product. People want to pay for the cheaper one. And for example, if something's coming from China and it's created with very cheap that pollutes a lot, these modernizing economies need to be able to tax and thus force the hand, like we're seeing with the United States and the tariffs that are coming about. To bring all that together, what are your thoughts on those type of changes that we've talked about with the importance of it? Because I don't really think it was always like that, right? I think this, within the last few years, we've realized that, hey, we have to bring in these taxes to these major carbon emitters so that we can level out the playing field. So let's talk a little bit about that and some of the other changes that are like that on a political scale that could influence things on a more systemic level.
Yeah, it's a very timely question, right? So there has been a lot of talks over the past many months about the loss of competitiveness in Europe specifically. And then, of course, Trump and I think even Biden agrees that the way that currently the competitiveness is affected in the US by many things is negative. And we see the backlash of that right now. I'll stay within my geographical region, even though I'm now closer to the US, being on Curaçao, but my background is European. Europe has, in my opinion, played the part of a noble idiot over the past 20 years. Europe was very early in its fight against climate change, and all the leading at the charge was Germany, who very early has paid huge renewables tariffs for renewables producers and has done a lot to its Energiewende, energy transition is a very ambitious program to phase out coal and nuclear at the same time, and so on. There's a long list of examples. I applaud that's the right sort of direction. But what they have missed is that if they do that, they have to create a fair environment. And they have not done that. They have, in a way, expected their business sector, their industrial sector, to somehow figure it out without the right political support. And this has led to very perverse effects. One thing is called carbon leakage that I just want to quickly explain, right? Where, let's assume you set a carbon price within a certain geographical area like Europe. So everyone who's producing aluminum in Europe and emits carbon needs to pay for that. That makes that produced aluminum significantly more expensive because aluminum is a very emissive material, right? So emissions can be 16, 17, 18 tons of CO2 for 1 ton of aluminum. Now, what happens is that aluminum producers in Europe die out because they can't compete in the world market anymore. What also happens is that the demand for aluminum goes down in Europe. So what happens instead is that aluminum is being imported from other regions in the world to Europe. Because in other regions in the world, aluminum producers are still allowed to emit as much as they want, don't have to pay for it, and can produce aluminum relatively cheap. So what have we done? We have reduced emissions in Europe. That's great. We have done it because we have killed an industry. That's not so great. And at the same time, we have globally actually probably increased emissions because often that aluminum that we're now buying comes from other regions where there's even less environmental standards and even older technology or dirtier technology. So there's more emissions per ton of aluminum. That's carbon leakage. We have just shifted the carbon emissions from Europe somewhere else. And in the process of doing so, increased emissions and killed an industry. That's a pretty dumb thing to do. And unfortunately, that's what we did for a long time. And then there were many instruments that Europeans tried to do to address this by, for example, giving allocations of carbon to those aluminum producers in Europe, which basically means, yes, we have a carbon price, but you don't have to pay for it, and only in the future. But that also didn't help because it sets a very unclear investment climate. Right? Would you invest into new facilities in Europe if you don't know when and how much you have to pay? No. So that is all not great. And there are many examples for that. Germany with its solar industry that died because the Chinese could produce cheaper and Germany just paid the same sort of tariffs to everyone. And I think recently Europe has woken up a little bit, at least, and has started to say, okay, we still think that fighting climate change is an important thing. We still think that clean technologies are future technologies. So investing in them and transitioning towards them is good business for the future. But in the meantime, we also have to make sure that we stop the loss of competitiveness. We stop our deindustrialization. So things like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which is a regulation that came into force just a year ago, and that I think within the next year is meant to actually take full grip by actually making importing emissions more expensive. That is the right approach, I think. And there's probably many more things that Europe has to do to protect its industry from being at a disadvantage from, quote unquote, doing the right thing, which is stopping climate change. I think the same can probably be said about the US as well. The US has always been, to a certain extent, smarter because they have not gone that path of we just do what's right and accept the loss of competitiveness. But also they are waking up to this idea that we can't just see our entire industry move into other regions because we're trying to decarbonize. So we have to work on this.
And I remember maybe a decade ago, one of the common thoughts was that someday we are going to run out of fossil fuels. And I think that argument has largely disappeared because there are still so many reserves and deposits of fossil fuels. For example, right near you in Venezuela, there are $3.3 trillion, 50% more actually than Saudi Arabia. They have the most petroleum and fossil fuel deposits in the world. It's very crude. It's very sludge based. So there's a lot of science that needs to go into it. That's why it hasn't been tapped. And obviously the political area around there is not supporting the right expertise coming into play. And do you think that we're on a better path now in the United States or a worse path? Because in the inauguration, Trump is saying, we're going to drill, baby, drill, because when you look at it, that's going to bring down prices. What's the best way to stop inflation? Of course, less spending, first and foremost. The impact and the desire of the demand, like you're talking about, is still for people to pay cheaper for things. Do you think that we're on a better path than we were maybe 2 years ago or a worse path? And I think maybe one of the augmenting factors could be advances in technology and just better appetites, better business cases that are becoming possible because of people like yourself. And how could we balance? Is there a way we can balance both cheaper things for everyday people and also being on the right path from a sustainability perspective?
Lots to unpack here. Brief my reflections on drill, baby, drill. I'm not sure that if you would ask an oil executive in the US right now, that they are actually too happy to hear that. Because what happens for everyone who knows supply and demand, drill, baby, drill means that the price will go down. If there's more supply at a certain stable demand or a certain insensitive demand, it just means the price goes down, which means profits go down, right? And the OPEC knows this already for decades. That's why they control their supply. They control how much can be produced because they want to keep a stable or high price. Drill, baby, drill is absolutely dumb because it just, ask an oil executive, they might now feel forced to do that, to be in good grace with the president and his team, but it is not good economics. I think what is meant by that is actually they want to reduce the prices for the end consumer. So of course, if the price goes down, then the price at the pump goes down. But it's really questionable whether this is industrially, business-wise, a great strategy or policy. What's to a certain extent behind that, I can probably subscribe to a certain extent. I never thought I would say that, but I think there has been an absolute wild growth of regulation, both in the US and in Europe. And there's a very urgent need of deregulation and also debureaucratization, if that is a word. Sorry, I'm not a native English speaker. And that is something I think is a good thing to do. I just would pledge that we need to do this in the right sectors and in the right way. Go back to Europe, there's this omnibus regulation that is coming. And it is meant to combine multiple different regulations that have put an incredible strain on businesses. There is the CSRD, which is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Then there's the CSDDD, and there's the CBAM, and there's all sorts of regulation. And when I talk to customers, I basically only hear them saying, like, we need to figure out this regulation. That's our priority. I have heard multiple times over the past year, we cannot work on decarbonization, actually reducing emissions, because we're so busy figuring out how to report and fulfill all those requirements. So this idea of unifying it, simplifying it, is a great idea. And I think in Trump's credit, and that's the thing that I never thought I would say, like, deregulating is a good thing. But I think the way that he intends it to do is almost forcing it in the wrong direction. It's forcing companies to drill. It's forcing consumers to choose fossil fuels, etc., because it fits his overall political and almost identity political native of the wokest left with the sustainability stuff. We are against them. So everyone needs to drive an oil guzzler and everyone needs to use lots of pork and beef and whatnot. And that is also not really taking into account that many people don't want it, right? And I think deregulation is good, but where deregulation becomes a requirement and a force for actually oil executives to drill, even though they might not want to drill, that's crazy. So to a certain extent, I would make sure that the market can work better and that companies can actually focus on what's needed, and that includes deregulation.
If you could redesign things from scratch, what would be your approach?
A carbon price. I think it's not going to be the silver bullet. Nothing is in this challenge. But a carbon price is honestly a very market-focused instrument to solve this. And I want to go back to one thing you said and connect it. So you said we're not running out of fossil fuels. I actually, together with my team in Oxford back then, years ago, we wrote a research paper on this. And we did a lot of research, not only on oil and gas and coal, but on, I think, a total of 60 different raw materials, resources, etc. And we basically followed their production and their reserves over time. Because the Club of Rome has already a long time ago said we're going to run out of all sorts of stuff. And the funny thing is, we thought we would run out of almost everything that we consume. From diamonds to gold to tungsten to oil to everything, coal. There were points in history where we thought we're going to run out. And you know what happens? We invent, we create new technologies, we find ways to get more of this. Because if you think of the Earth, multiple trillion tons of material, right? Every single thing that you can think of, we have an abundance of in the Earth. The question is usually, can we get it out in a productive way, in an economically feasible way? And once we start running out of things, typically prices go up, which sets an incentive for technologies to innovate. and find new ways to get it out of the crust or the ground, which again increases supply and the prices keep stable. So if you follow this over decades, the reserve to production ratio typically stays the same or goes up, which means we are not running out of anything, neither gas, nor oil, nor coal, nor anything, right? Now, what we are running out of is space in the atmosphere to actually store that excess carbon that we're pumping up there at the billions of tons every year. And why are we running out of this? Because it's not priced. In a world in which the market would work well, that space in the atmosphere would be a resource, a good as anything else, and it would have a price. So if you want to take up space in the atmosphere, you have to pay a price. If we start running out of it, the price goes up, which means you reduce your consumption of it, or you find new ways to create new space, which means negative emissions technologies. We pump it out of the air, we pump it back into the ground, we get money for it, great business. So going back to your question, a carbon price would set the right signals in terms of innovation, in terms of consumption, etc., to solve a lot of those issues. But unfortunately, implementing that in every sector of society and economy in all regions of the world to stay fair now is very difficult. And there's not a lot of political will. If I had the opportunity to design everything from scratch, carbon would be priced, everyone would have to pay for using it, and that would also lead to the creation of new space in the atmosphere.
And one of the things which Terralytic could help with, and you mentioned with some of the regulations that it's so much reporting that has tremendous costs because you likely have to bring in high-paid consultants who know how to quantify or have better models by which to do, is really what I'm getting at here is the quantification is very difficult. Would you agree in terms of to quantify accurately, to assess a proper price? You could probably also argue the same in terms of our models and our understanding of other natural resources, but how big of an issue is quantification in forming a carbon price, or is it really just this global political shift that has to go along with it so that we can adopt that and enforce it? And of course, if you do the math, it would be insane numbers across the entire planet just because we're talking about such a large change. But it is something that by market forces, by some of the pre-existing examples that you've laid out there, it would be able to make a significant difference.
Yeah. So quantification is a very difficult thing. And that's what we specialized, right? So now going really into the shoes of a typical procurement manager, a sustainable procurement manager in one of our customers' organizations. So put yourself in these shoes. You're tasked to reduce carbon in your supply chain. Your company perhaps has corporate-wide targets that they have publicly announced and committed to. You have a sustainability department that in a way tracks it and that gives you the mandate to work on it, and perhaps you even have a budget. Now you turn around and you try to figure out where to get started, right? First of all, you have tens of thousands of suppliers, large and small ones in all regions of the world. We have a very global supply chain, and that means that it's very intransparent where emissions actually happen. There's many approaches that try to do this. The ones that are mostly used today, like spend-based accounting, industry average emission factors, like things that you get from a database and you slap on the dollar number you spend. That's very inaccurate, very unhelpful to actually take activity. It's compliant. You can use that, and Greenhouse Gas Protocol is okay with that, but it doesn't help you identify intervention points, going back to that word, right? And even worse, once you start talking to a supplier, you realize that your tier one supplier, so the person that you can perhaps meet for a coffee or that you can talk to, they have a very tiny amount of carbon in their own operations because they in turn buy materials, which, from another supplier who in turn buys materials. Many supply chains are 6, 7, 8 tiers deep, which means that many emissions are far away removed from you. Again, going back to aluminum, you typically buy an aluminum part, which comes from someone who forges it or casts it or whatever. They buy aluminum ingots. The person who makes these ingots perhaps buys aluminum from another smelter. So the smelter might be 2, 3 tiers away from you, and that's where most of your emissions happen. In many cases, you don't even know where that smelter is. Could be in Poland, could be in Norway, could be in China, right? You don't know that. So that's really difficult. And that's where we help companies understand exactly where in their supply chain emissions happen, how they happen, and what can be done to reduce this. So now, how does this help you? It helps you see carbon more on equal level as quality and cost, right? Because suddenly you understand who of your suppliers have how much carbon. You start understanding where can I actually have an impact. So those corporate level targets, which could be 20% reduction in my supply chain by 2030, it's a very common target. That's the style of it. You can suddenly break that down into, okay, steel is actually few suppliers. We know them well. We know what needs to be done. We can have a big impact here. So maybe for steel, this is 40%. Aluminum, same story, right? We know what needs to be done. We know our suppliers. We have understood this. So for aluminum can also be 40%. Plastic, really difficult to decarbonize. Electronics, really difficult to decarbonize. So perhaps for electronics and plastics, it's only 5%. So you can take those corporate targets and you start breaking them down to suppliers and categories in a way that reflects how much influence you have on those value chains. And it reflects what you can actually do to reduce. It's much more likely that you can achieve this in such a way than just slapping 20% on everything. And then going back to your carbon price, some of our customers, they set a carbon price and they use this to decide which suppliers to go for. So when they send an RFQ and suppliers submit their proposals, they take carbon as one value that they evaluate and they put a carbon price of that. But even here, I would say you can't just take a unified carbon price on everything. You need to reflect how difficult it is to decarbonize. You're not going to stop buying electronics if you produce a car, right? Every car is electronics. You can't just stop buying electronics because it's difficult to decarbonize. But what you can do is you can relatively with a carbon price start to switch between suppliers and set targets, etc.
How does the process differ from something like green steel or green aluminum versus the traditional methods?
Oh, good question. So green aluminum, for example, right? As I mentioned, the biggest source of emissions for aluminum is actually two things. It's the electricity that's used in the smelter. So aluminum goes through a smelting process that uses huge amounts of electricity. Electricity in turn is in many grids still produced from coal or gas plants, and that is a big part of the emissions footprint of aluminum. The second part is a process emission, which is you use big carbon anodes in the smelter. Those carbon anodes over time degrade, which means they emit CO2. That's part of the chemical process. One simple way to reduce your emission footprint significantly is to use low carbon electricity instead, right? You could do this by, of course, renewables, but you need a lot of that. Or you switch to regions where there's a lot of hydropower. Some of the greenest aluminum in the world comes from Quebec, for example, where there is a lot of hydropower, or Norway, which same thing. So if you think about what can I do, you can start working with your suppliers, basically asking them to switch from their grid electricity to green electricity. Might cost you a certain price premium that you may or may not be willing to pay. Or you could imagine switching your suppliers to a smelter that is in Norway, in Quebec, in other regions where the grid electricity today is already very low. And that also will immediately reduce your carbon footprint. It might not even increase the cost of your aluminum significantly. For steel, it's a bit more difficult. Much steel in Europe comes from something that's called a blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route, which is a way to produce new steel, which basically you use iron ore and coal. You reduce the iron ore, which means there's a chemical process that happens that emits a lot of CO2, but you get pig iron out of this. And then you use a steel furnace where you again have a lot of emissions and you have virgin steel, new steel. You can also use more recycled in a scrap furnace, an electric arc furnace, which in turn uses electricity instead of coal or gas, which means you reduce your emissions significantly depending on how you generate your electricity. But that's a good way to increase more recycled. And you can also, of course, use more innovative things like hydrogen. Hydrogen actually also helps to reduce the iron ore. So it takes over the role of coal in that chemical reaction that produces pig iron. And then depending on how you produce the hydrogen, of course, it can be cleaner. If you get your hydrogen, of course, from what I mentioned before, taking natural gas and cracking this, you might not have a big impact. So there's so many factors that play a role, but there is very clean ways of producing iron and steel today. They're just currently still, depending on the region, very expensive.
How much more expensive?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't tell you that from the top of my head. I would have to check our models again. It is really depending on the region, because just as an example, the US has a lot of electric arc furnaces because electricity in the US tends to be cheaper than in Europe. In Europe, electricity is more expensive in most regions, which is why we haven't seen that uptake of electric arc furnaces yet. However, in the US, much electricity comes from natural gas, which in turn emits, right? So there's really many factors at play here. We model all of this. So when we assess changes, we take into account what is the carbon content of electricity in that region, what is the cost of electricity in that region. So our models always spit out a carbon impact point, if you will, but they also spit out how much more or less would that cost you, because perhaps electricity is really expensive. So switching to an electric arc furnace reduces your emissions significantly, but at the same time, it would increase your cost significantly, right? Because again, company is not going to do this if there's not a business case. So you need to create transparency about investment needs, impact on cost, and impact on carbon.
What are your thoughts on large one-shot interventions like what has been discussed before, where if we just had, and of course, this is a big, if we just had a 100 by 100 mile grid of solar panels in Nevada, which is a small, actually, relative portion of Nevada because it's so much desert. And if we just had that, then we'd be able to power the United States independently, energy-wise.
Yeah, where's the redundancy in that? So one thing goes wrong, and it's very unlikely, but one meteor is smashing on that thing, and you have no electricity for the coming years. So one like cold fusion, right? I don't believe in. It's, in my mind, akin to going to the casino and putting everything on black. Great, could work out, and you double your money. Could also be you lose everything, and then what? Right? I mean, I'm not a big gambler anyway, so I wouldn't do that anyway. I think, again, going back, you need a portfolio of technologies, a portfolio of solutions, and you need to be careful with the weighting of your investments in that portfolio and let that be informed by the market and where's the most likely return on your investment. And the return on investment can be multiple. It can be like on impact that you can achieve from it, but of course, it needs to be financial return as well. I think large projects play a role, but I call it large projects, not like one large project solving it all. Large projects can help reduce cost because they help scale a technology. Think of solar, right? Germany, I mentioned this, Germany has put a lot of financial incentives into scaling solar in Germany in the 2000s and 2010s. That has led to the global price for solar panels to drop significantly, which then set an incentive to actually for the uptake in other countries, which accelerated that process. So that was a one-shot project of Germany that helped significantly. It didn't do all the job. There were many factors involved. But without Germany, I don't think the uptake of solar and the cost reduction of solar would have been possible in that way. So that was a great thing to do, and it played a huge role. But at no point was it like Germany is going to solve climate change either by itself or it's not going to be solved, right? So I'm not a big fan of those ideas or projects. They're fun thought experiments, right? If we just had the size of Italy in the Sahara of solar panels, then the whole world could have renewable electricity forever. Yeah, great. How do you transport it? How do you protect it? About the political questions and so on. I don't believe in that.
For sure. And I don't think a lot of people understand how important the transportation of energy is within that equation. As you try against the
You
overload.
lose a lot.
Exactly. And then that would get into different types of material science that are necessary. And that's really the big equation of how we all get to that level, the material science to maintain the concentration of energy across a long span of distance.
Yeah, going back to my portfolio idea, right? That's not my idea. I shouldn't plan that. I'm certainly not smart enough to have come up with it, and it's something that's been around for many years, but not even only in electricity sources, like all sorts of scientific and technological fields need to see investment and need to be supported. Like material science is a great point. Like there's just a lot of technologies that can, for example, reduce the loss of transmission of electricity. Because when you transmit electricity, a huge amount of the electricity that we generate never gets used because it gets lost in all sorts of efficiency and transportation losses. Certain new materials and new technologies can actually solve this. Imagine if, 100% electricity 20% gets lost, and you can halve. That's 10% of all electricity generation that suddenly is unnecessary or can be made more efficient. You can convert it immediately to emissions. Imagine the impact you can have. So yes, investments in a lot of technologies are needed and smart if you want to solve this. There's not this one technology that will solve it all.
Exactly. So to answer the question, if someone were to ask, what's the one thing that would make the biggest difference? The one major innovation, it's actually what you just said. It's actually investing in a host of different innovations and working across different disciplines, different fields to build a better system that can start to influence on a greater scale those tipping points when it comes to our sustainability and approach on achieving a level that will create a better future for our next generations.
Yeah. Speaking of something like this, many people will have heard of the Apollo program, right? Which made it possible for a man on the moon.
Mhm.
Nobody should think that every single scientist in the Apollo program was just building a rocket, right? There were many scientists working on things like materials that you use in these boosters on the in and outside, on the heating protection in front of the space shuttle, working on textiles to use in the astronaut spacesuits, and so many different things. It was a giant investment that the US did back then into a myriad of things that were all needed to get a man on the moon. And that's also how you should think about solving climate change. It's not about solar cells only. It's not about wind only. It's not about hydrogen only. It's about a million things that need to fall in place in order to solve this. And the things are reinforcing each other and have other uses as well, right? We got, what's it called? Velcro, that thing, that closing mechanism that came out of space technology, right? Similar to renewables or to generally clean tech, there's so many things that come out of there that have another use case as well that make our lives actually better, that it's really not wasted money.
Major scale, like in that particular case, 60,000 engineers working for a decade. And the process by which they did it was, first, if we want to get to the moon and bring a man to the moon and back, we need to know how to build the most effective booster systems. And then we need to know how to get that booster system up to orbit. Then we need to figure out how to sustain in orbit. Then it was this very step-by-step approach. And then we need to figure out how the vehicle can come back onto Earth. And then finally, now we need to do all those things with humans aboard. So it's that step-by-step with many people with decades or potentially more of really focused work to get to that level, to get to that point.
It's funny, I asked a good friend, ChatGPT, because I got curious myself. And what's a good thing that came out of clean tech research that we now also use in other applications, right? Because I made that example and I couldn't think of a great example myself right now. There's apparently a thing that's called aerogel insulation. And I'm mentioning this because it was originally developed for clean tech applications, but now guess what? It's used in space exploration. So here's the other way around. Now we are starting to develop things in the clean tech sector that are used for space. I will say that this aerogel insulation apparently also has applications in medical and clothing and so on.
What's the base of that? Is that, so I've definitely heard of that, but I forget there's a base material that specifically that gives it those properties. You should probably ask. I think it's just interesting to connect it.
Yeah, I can ask. Depends on the type. It's silica and silicon dioxide. So it was used for building insulation. And when I hear silica and silicon dioxide, I would bet that creating solar cells probably had a role to play here as well for making that cheaper. And it's now used in many different sectors like textile, medical, etc. I'm sure there's many more good examples. My point here being that these investments, they tend to benefit us rather than strain us. And for us, even as the consumer, this is good business. And again, I want to encourage people, and I benefit, of course, from people going on my LinkedIn profile. It gives me a great confidence boost and whatnot. But I have an example there that I actually experienced myself, because on Curaçao, buildings and everything tend to be very energy inefficient. And we had a huge energy and electricity consumption here. It's hot, we have air conditions, and we had an incredible amount of kilowatt hours that we used every day. So we started hunting down where are the sort of efficiency wastes. And we made some really small investments. I would love to show you, but I would rather not move the camera. But we have like little things under the door that keep the door more shut so the cold cannot go out. And I kid you not, we have reduced our energy consumption by more than half. It's not a joke. And given that electricity is very expensive on this island, We are actually saving a ton of money, and I'm talking hundreds of dollars every month while using less electricity and therefore also emitting less. And these little plastic things for under the door, they were very cheap. Just to make the point, often these investments, they actually tend to benefit us rather than strain us.
Yeah, I think in the Apollo program is a tremendous example of that, because if you ask ChatGPT everything that came out of that, it's absolutely mind blowing. I'm pretty sure there was better refrigerator technology, there's better food production technology, there's better transportation technologies. It's endless what happens when large numbers of people that are disciplinary work on solving major challenges. So it's a big call to action here for all those listening, that your efforts are fruitful and can make a major impact, and call to action for greater collaboration across different disciplines and spaces and markets and industries. What about your average
Yeah.
everyday listener? Go ahead.
Would I forget this? There's another great example. Lithium-ion batteries. The reason this has come down in cost so much and the technology has improved so much is because of the investments made in the electric vehicle sector. And now the reason your iPhone is, quote, it's not really cheap, right? Let's be honest, but it's only as expensive as it is. The battery lasts for a long time is partly because of that. So there's probably some better examples than aerogel, but it's one of those.
And so what would be one action that people can take post, they just close out the podcast, they go back to their lives? What is one thing that they can do that would drastically improve their lives, but also make a difference in the greater picture and the greater system?
I want to mention three, and I'll try to keep this short. I think the one thing they can do to benefit the environment a little bit, but benefit their wallet probably a large bit, is hunt down inefficiencies in your house. We did this, and we do this on an ongoing base every now and then to figure out what else can we do. Sometimes there are so simple things that you can do. You will not have any sort of sacrifice of comfort even, right? I still run my air conditioner. I just make sure that the cold that I generate stays in the room. So you won't have a discomfort, but sometimes you can have a huge saving in the electricity that you consume. Same holds true for the gasoline if you still drive an internal combustion engine car, etc. There's certain things you can do that will just save energy, save emissions, and save money. That's always good, right? And it won't take you a lot of investment or even effort. The second thing I want to do is be more mindful of what you buy. There's probably lots that has been said about Temu and so on. There seems to be a current uptake in buying things that you really don't need and that you're planning to throw out within days or weeks. And that's because they're cheap and so on. You're setting an awful signal to Chinese manufacturers or Asian manufacturers. The signal is, okay, people like cheap, so we're going to continue to produce it. And then you're in this downward spiral in which they try to outcompete each other for cheaper and cheaper, which often comes at the expense of the environment. And you as the consumer send the signal to your own industry, to your own companies in your own country. Oh, apparently this is what the consumer wants. So we got to play along with this. And they start that as well. So look a little bit like, what are the signals I send with my own consumption behavior? Signals in the right way. So if there's two relatively equal pieces of clothing or products of which one is a sort of auditable or like a proven lower environmental footprint, choose that, because you send a signal to both companies. The one that sells that product, that what they are doing is what the consumer wants, and also you send a signal to the other company of which you don't buy the product. Okay, apparently that's not what the consumer wants, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing I mentioned is be informed where you cast your vote. It's easy to get focused only on one thing, right? Right. These days it's immigration, or it could be sort of wokeism or whatever. It's like there's lots of different things that could be the one thing you cast your vote on. I think you should take a more balanced approach. I don't want to be too prescriptive. Everyone can cast their vote however they want. But the approach that I take is that I regularly look into the program and the things that the parties say. And I mean, I come from a region that has multiple parties. In the US, I know there's two major parties, but even within those parties, on like more regional and local elections, you might have more choices, right? And be mindful about where you cast your vote, because again, those politicians, they set the stage on which everything else happens.
Dr. Alex, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. For everybody that is listening, make sure to check out Terralytic, or Alex's LinkedIn. We'll include links to both in the description below, and we will see you all in the next interview. Thanks again, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, thank you for watching this episode of Tightens Up today. What did you learn from it? Make sure to drop a comment below with your most valuable insight so that other people can engage in the conversation around what this speaker brought to the table. And then on another front, make sure to subscribe so that every time we drop a new episode, you will be notified. And that way you can keep fueling your dreams and your brain with fresh insights which can help you along your journey and along your path to your goals. So thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next interview.